Our second keynote panelist is Michael Rock, a founding partner and creative director at the design studio 2x4 and director of the graphic architecture project at the Columbia University Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. Okay, I'm sick of the boilerplate. I first heard about Michael Rock when I was a junior editor at Print, and I was the one who was moderating, or not moderating, but kind of organizing the Tibor Duffy debate. And I got this incredibly intelligent letter from some unknown designer named Michael Rock, basically explaining why, as I recall, both parties were wrong. So anyway, one of the most insightful designers and design writers around is about to now make his presentation.
Okay, I have to start off with a few caveats. Basically, all day yesterday I was at the Crits at Yale, and all morning today I was at the Crits at Columbia, and last night I was at the opening for the Alphabet Show at MoMA. So I feel like any sense of certainty I had about anything is now gone. So I'm completely confused and baffled by design education and design and everything. The second rule is that you never, ever speak after Michael Bierut. And I think when Alice told me that, I was just like, it's just impossible situation. So since I can't possibly compete on that level, I can only present in absolute earnestness, so I'll try that. I'm also, because this is an academic conference, I'm going to read something, and something that's kind of unfinished piece of writing that I'm working on now, and almost as a test case. And it's unusual for me because I rarely read presentations. I usually speak about the slides I'm looking at. But I think actually this is a good location to try that. So I have a problem with space. It's not that graphic designers don't talk about space. On the contrary, we're obsessed with it. We talk about the space between things, letters, lines, columns, gutters, the space inside of things, like counterforms, and the space around things, margins, borders, and frames. But our favorite subject, the one which we're almost religiously attached, is the idea of white space. White space, especially for those of us that were trained as modern designers, exudes a kind of mystical, only partially containable power. The control of white space, in fact, the ability to even see white space, is one of the designer's alchemic tricks and the sign of basic modern competence. White space, of course, is a two-dimensional kind of space, a product of modernization of the printed page. In effect, white space did not exist as a concept, as a kind of visual derivative that could be traded on the market of critique, until it was invented at the turn of the century by Lissitzky, Chikold, Bayer, Rodchenko, and the company. White space is to be regarded as an active element, not a passive background. It's interesting to look at the construction of this. White space is to be, not should be, or could be, or might be. White space is to be regarded as an active element. The revolution in typography was the inclusion of white space into the compositional dynamic. In the days of the illuminated manuscript and the incunabula, margins existed as a repository for sooty fingerprints, often filled with illumination and left wide enough to be regularly trimmed off by well-worn edges frayed. I don't think the monks were discussing white space. But compositional space requires the manipulation of plastic forms within the frame of some clearly defined edges. That space can have depth, a kind of depth, but in an extremely undeep way. Thus, in 2D design, we talk about one form being on top of another, but that Z dimension, if it could be measured at all, works in the scale of microns, the thickness of a layer of ink. That doesn't stop us from talking as if things really did recede or come forward, but ultimately our work is in the third dimension is always, ultimately in our work, the third dimension is always a metaphoric depth. In other words, our depth is almost always phenomenal depth, not literal. The illusion of depth pervades everything we do. In fact, we routinely work with software that allows us to bring to front and send to back, or manipulate the relationship between a series of layers, each one in front of the other. These metaphoric layers can then be flattened to recombine into a single seamless whole. The flatten command obliterates the temporary condition of depth and returns work to the state of pure superficiality. It's hard to describe your work as superficial in a non-pejorative way. Superficial is the ultimate insult. What's worse than being shallow? It's an image I love from Terry Gilliam's film Brazil, where the highway is lined by these billboard images that completely obliterates the background. I think, in fact, that part of the appeal of the theory of subliminal messages in advertising is that we simply can't accept that anything could be so stupidly obvious. But clearly it can. But taken at face value, one of the attributes of superficiality, the word is simply descriptive, to be on the surface. I find this notion rather more comforting than insulting. I can relate to both the spatial aspect, to coat or to skin, and the metaphoric, to be obvious. And so I think not only is superficiality a perfectly apt description of graphic design, it can be described an active and fruitful methodology. The standard way of understanding surface has been as an abstract and undifferentiated plane that functions above all to veil or delimit depth. That's from Sylvia Lavin. But suppose the surface did not in fact delimit, but activated. Lavin calls this strategy the deeply superficial, and I propose the idea of phenomenal depth. In the trajectory of our own work, from the manipulation of elements on pages to the insertion of images into buildings, has both challenged and reified this commitment to the superficial. In the early days of the studio, the scale of the work was often determined by the laser printer. When you're working on the design of a single page to be read by a single person, the spatial issues are literally at hand. White space can be wrenched to performing the duty of form. But we're also thinking about the layering as a way to achieve some kind of phenomenal depth. And I thought this is a very beautiful example of that. This notion is demonstrated very beautifully by Michael Bierut, this ongoing series of posters for the Yale School of Architecture. And I see Michael's growing series as an extended meditation on the manipulation of white space, more than anything about information. In his treatise on the language of vision, Kepish suggests that the plastic organization and stabilization of an image is an essential to the human condition as photosynthesis is to plants. Just as the letters of an alphabet can be put together in innumerable ways to form words which convey meanings, so the optical measures and qualities can be brought together in innumerable ways, and each particular relationship generates a different sensation of space. The variations to be achieved are endless. So the whole formal problem of the graphic designer can be reduced to this single problem: how to generate the sensation of space, or put more simply, how do you deal with flatness? When I was 17, my sister and I fumbled into a commission from a hometown bar that we frequented. And in exchange for an open bar tab, we started a kind of graphic novel that played out over the course of a year on the wall of the bar. We painted the frames directly on the wall using a mixture of powdered lime, milk, and water on a chalkboard surface. Painting in white allows the designer always to be working in counterform, drawing the white space out of the black. But it was also an early volley in this ongoing problem of space, both the compositional and architectural sense. The compositional problem is how to work in reverse, how to create space on a field of black. But it also forced us to consider the way in which the graphic interacted with the spatial and the temporal. Over the years, I've repeatedly returned to those problems in many different ways. And in fact, the relationship between flatness and depth, the trilateral dynamic of the formal, the spatial, and the temporal, became a defining feature of the way we work. In pushing the work to be investigative, to make the work itself our critical tool, we tried to understand this multivalent nature of the problem with space. This problem was exacerbated as we increasingly applied our graphic ideas to architecture, because one of the basic tenets of modernity is the resistance to applique. Mark Wigley opens his treatise on the modernity of walls, called White Walls and Designer Dresses, with the assertion, "The identity of modern architecture is inseparable from the whiteness of its surfaces." He cites the 1927 Weissenhof as the apogee of the purity, the whiteness of their walls, and the flatness of their roofs, the only restrictions placed on the 16 famous architects that gathered to build them. And he cites Corbusier's attachment to whiteness to morality. Whitewash is extremely moral. Suppose there was a decree requiring all rooms in Paris to be given a coat of whitewash. I maintain that there would be a police task of real stature and a manifestation of high morality, the sign of a great people. You could say that the modernist brand was embodied by the whiteness of the walls. But the very whiteness of the wall invites to facing. The white modern wall is a kind of provocation. When dealing with the application of the graphic to the architectural, the designer is immediately confronted with the issue of application. We accept our usual condition is a wall. As designers often come into the building after the fact, the wall is almost already there. We are then faced with a choice. How do I put something on the wall? It seems simple enough. Can anyone really do this for a living? But answering that question is essential to the nature of the graphic, because the nature of the application challenges the notion of the spatial presence of the wall itself. This set us off on a decade-long meditation on the problem of flatness. This investigation is entirely separate from the real, specific issues of content, program, site, context, and function that each project deals with individually. In this way, a designer working through the medium of a design practice organizes a formal, speculative process which skims along the back of professional work. There are multiple serious questions with which we grapple with on a daily basis, most quite decidedly not about form making. In many ways, the work of a design professional at this moment in time is as much about systems, content, image, and technology management as it is about formal investigation. However, form will always be at the end of our work, and in many ways, the end that links us most closely with the historical practice of graphic design. And so this is a whole series of projects that we've done, many in conjunction with Rem Koolhaas and Office for Metropolitan Architecture, which always somehow deal with this idea of the illusion of depth or the problematization of the wall space itself. This is the Wiley Theater in Dallas with these large, about 21'2" shades that are printed with this curtain so that the flat surface becomes articulated again. Or here, the space which becomes the walls eliminated entirely by the injection of smoke. And then increasingly working with projection, here, the Miu Miu show in Milan, where a kind of video game space that's created as a wrapping kind of flat depth that serves as a background for the fashion show, where kind of the sky constantly drips with cactuses and bananas and mushrooms. And here, a space entirely wrapped with projection, so the walls disappear. And the projection works with a series of Piranesian projections, the kind of classic single-point perspective of space, that then slowly are overgrown by these kind of ghastly 21-foot flowers that fill the room. And so the space changes inexplicably from one form of flatness to another, or one form of depth to another. And here, the Chanel headquarters in Hong Kong, where the building itself becomes a kind of snow globe, the structure, the flatness of the building sort of undermined by the video projection that happens inside it. So that creates a space somewhere in between the facade itself and this kind of in-between uncertain space somewhere deeper in the building. So I placed the origin of this narrativization of the wall with the development of plate glass. Glass allowed the building to become cinematic. Walter Benjamin, writing about the plate glass shop windows as screens ordered in the tight sequences along urban arcades, postulated that the abundance of industrial production demanded a delivery system to equal it. Windows present a dialectic, clamoring consumption on one side and endless cornucopia of production and display on the other. The more glorious the offering, the more dependent on constant revision. Benjamin said that plate glass basically invented fashion. Glass invents the fashion cycle and a new type, the window shopper. Plate glass is the medium, the tableau vivant, a single scene in a slow motion film. The second stage is electricity. Electricity invigorates typography. The night city is defined by a series of light experiences. Buildings are replaced by outlined or illuminated diagrams, ghosts of themselves. The electro-typographic spatial sensation overwrites architecture. Nervous architects framed the early electronic signs as a fungal growth infecting the city. Zoning ordinances describe signs as a blight, a visual kudzu. The third stage is media. The Eames multi-screen projection suggested a new kind of wall that demanded active reading. The space of a newspaper or an illustrated magazine is a grid in which information is arranged and rearranged as it comes in. A space the reader navigates in his or her own way, at a glance, or fully entering into a particular story. The reader, viewer, consumer constructs the space, participating actively in the design. It's a space where continuities are made through cutting. The same is true of the space of newsreels and television. The logic of the Eames multi-screens is simply the logic of the mass media. That's Beatrice Colomina, and I think that this idea of the kind of mediaization of the facade which is now kind of fully articulated in every major downtown, where the architecture disappears behind this incredible density of information. And the fourth stage is the kiss. As media becomes increasingly dematerialized, i.e. projection, light, and sound, the relationship between the wall and the intervention becomes more complex. This aspect of affecting a wall as a form of activation is beautifully theorized by Sylvia Lavin. A kiss is the coming together of two similar but not identical surfaces that soften, flex, and deform when in contact. The performance of temporary singularities, a union of bedazzling convergence and identification during which separation is inconceivable and inevitable. In the perfect kiss, there is no hierarchy, the space is shared equally. And Lavin talks about Doug Aiken's project at MoMA, Sleepwalkers, as this kiss where the images become part of the city, where the viewer becomes the flaneur again, to have to find the information, to move his body to find it again. And this overlaying of one media on top of the other, where the two things come to be a new form altogether. The result of the kiss is neither pure information nor decoration, but something else, and recently dubbed to the confound. The confounded wall is activated by the intense relationship thrust upon it. The frisson created a new experience that literally destabilizes the architectural narrative and supplants it with something new and strange. And I think this example from Blue, this kind of beautiful wall painting projects where the animation is actually performed on the surface of the building. And this one is particularly nice in the way that as it performs the facade of the building, it creates this illusion of depth through, like Michael's poster, a kind of graphic method. And then as it moves through the building, it actually then re-engages the wall, actually breaking through the wall and operating it again. So this moment where suddenly the wall is rematerialized, the action of the thickness is reinscribed. And I think it's a beautiful example of confounding. And finally, this from Banksy, painted on the wall and plastered on the wall, the Palestinian-Israeli wall. A kind of beautiful image, I think, where the kind of political moment that's created in this impossible situation. The addition to the wall creates a new condition that was unimaginable before. If graphic design in the purely visual sense of that term is ultimately about the manipulation of two-dimensional space, any research necessarily engages the expansion of that space into new ways of thinking. In changing the nature of what is understood as spatial, we engage our audience to re-examine the preconceived relationships with the world around them in new and surprising ways. Walls accumulate sensation, become communicative, flat becomes deep, static becomes dynamic. In making the world strange, we make it new, and that's hardly superficial. Thank you.